Thank you for joining us. I don't know about you, but I am feeling the emotional toll of hearing the heartbreaking daily reports of new coronavirus deaths alongside the surreal image of a president of the United States who acts more like the leader in a badly written dystopian novel, both of which stand in contrast to the beauty of these fall days. Regardless, we are glad that you have taken the time to join us, and I promise that today's conversation won't be all doom and gloom. My name is John Beebe, and I lead the Democratic Engagement Exchange in the Faculty of Arts at Ryerson University. I want to thank Dean Pam Sugerman and Melissa Wong and the entire team in the Faculty of Arts for making this event possible. If you're interested in learning more about our work, please visit our website at engagedemocracy.ca and follow us at RUEngageX. These days, I cannot take my dog for a walk without encountering someone who wants to talk about President Trump, and I certainly can't open any Canadian news source without encountering updates on the latest twists and turns in the presidential election. The political culture of the place where I used to call home and where I worked, Washington, D.C., is impacting our political culture here in Canada. But as someone who is still proud to call myself an American and even more grateful to call Canada home, I don't want us to draw the wrong conclusions about the United States or about the implications for how we should do politics in Canada. But one lesson is clear: democracy matters. No matter what you care about, climate change, income inequality, racial justice, quality education, economic opportunity, if we're going to tackle any of these issues, we require a vibrant and inclusive democracy. But I'm worried that in Canada we have become complacent and too often take our democracy for granted. And if there is any lesson that we can draw from events to our south, is that we can't be complacent. Civil society organizations, local leaders, regular citizens, and philanthropists, we must all step up and engage our democracy. And it's why I am grateful to the leadership shown by Dean Sugerman and Ryerson University, and want to thank Mayor Nenshi and Ambassador Mcnaughton for joining us today. And all of you who have taken the time to be here, because it is the work that you are doing that will ensure our democracy continues to thrive. Before we begin our conversation today, I'd like to share a land acknowledgement. As someone who has recently settled in this area with my family, I share this land acknowledgement because I recognize my presence here is only possible because of the generations of people who came before me. I would like to acknowledge that the land that I call home and where I work, Toronto, is sacred land. This land has been the site of human activity for more than 15,000 years. It is the territory of the Haudenosaunee nations, such as the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, and the Seneca, as well as the Anishinaabe, and most recently visited by the Mississaugas of New Credit. The territory later became the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Treaty, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe to peacefully share and care for the resources and relationships around the Great Lakes. And in this moment, I am powerfully reminded of the wisdom of this treaty, and that our presence here relies on all of us to take action for the collective good. And now, I'd like to turn it over to Martin Redcon. Martin is a political columnist for the Toronto Star, and while he would never say it, it is the largest and best newspaper in Canada, and if you don't subscribe, you should, if for no other reason than to read his column. Martin is also a visiting practitioner in the Faculty of Arts, and most importantly, a keen observer of political leadership and culture. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you, John, and welcome to our 11th Ryerson Democracy Forum, where we ask politicians and practitioners and professors and students how to do our democracy differently, how to get people engaged, how to keep them involved, and how to keep the faith. Our theme today is Donald Trump and Canada, how he changed our politics. And that's one of the questions to talk about today is, we know he's changing American politics, but what's the impact on our politics when everything is being turned upside down right below our border? We have two special guests. They're both great gets today. Let me tell you about them. David Mcnaughton is our former ambassador to Washington, D.C. He was there on the front lines when Donald Trump was there from 2016 to 2019. He was the Canadian in the lion's den. When Donald Trump declared NAFTA was dead, David Mcnaughton had to try to rescue it and reincarnate it so that Donald Trump could just rename it. Now, he was Canada's top diplomat in America, but I've never thought of David as all that diplomatic. He's actually pretty blunt and direct, and so I'm curious to see how candid he's going to be in a public setting today. The great thing about David is he's not just an America expert, he's also an expert and practitioner in Canadian politics. He was principal secretary to Dalton McGuinty when he was Premier of Ontario. He started out as a political aide to Canada's foreign minister a little while ago, and he ran a federal election campaign out of Ontario for Justin Trudeau. So he has seen it from both sides. He had a life before politics. He ran a political research firm, and he's run a consulting company or two, both out of New York, where he saw more of the US up front, and here in Toronto. And he's now Canadian president of Palantir Technologies. Nahid Nenshi is the mayor of Calgary, as you would know, a city that I have lived in and loved, Mr. Mayor. He first ran and won a decade ago, coming from out of nowhere to trump his opponents. And he has been reelected 2 more times. Now, he's not just a mayor of Calgary. I think it's fair to say he's an influencer nationally. That's what Maclean's called him, the second most influential person in Canada after the Prime Minister. And if I read it in Maclean's, it must be true. And he had a life before politics as well. He ran a consulting company of his own. He worked at McKinsey and Company. And he ran he advised public companies, nonprofits, and gave advice to the government of Alberta, to the United Nations, and worked as an academic as well. So he's right at home here on campus, teaching management of nonprofits at Mount Royal University, forgive me. I always mix up my mounts. Mount Royal University in Calgary, I should know that. He also studied at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. So more face time for him in the US. He's done his time. One little secret about the mayor, I said he had a life before politics, but that's not really true, because as soon as he became a grown-up, he ran for student government and was student council president at U of Calgary. So student politics, we all know, is a lot tougher than real politics. John gave my secret away in the introductions. I usually cheat here, and I talk about how the Toronto Star is the biggest and best newspaper in Canada. But I'm not going to say that, because I wanted to just draw out the mayor just for a quick 30-second hello and talk about how the Toronto Star was part of his life when he was growing up in Tanzania. How did the Toronto Star get your family here? Can you tell us what happened?
I love that the Toronto Star loves this story. And I end up having to tell it all the time. But it is a good one, because it talks a lot about Canada and about who we are as Canadians. So when my parents were working as a young newlywed couple with a small child, not me, my sister, they were working in a hotel in a place called Arusha, which is at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro. And while they were there, because that place is always used for lots of international aid conferences and so on. It continues to be used a lot by the United Nations. So they met some Canadian aid workers. And those Canadian aid workers used to have the Toronto Star delivered to them in their diplomatic pouches. So they get weeks and weeks old Toronto Stars. Now, recognizing that we are virtually on a university campus today, and apologies to you, Martin, I need to explain this. So a newspaper is sort of like an iPad, but it's kind of printed out. So for those of you who are under the age of 40, just so you understand what we're talking about here.
Can I just ask, what is an iPad?
But
gotcha. Sorry.
They used to get the Toronto Star. My dad was a voracious reader, and so he would always get the Star when they were done with it and read up and learn all about this country across the world that he had never heard of. And he was particularly fascinated with the building of the Toronto City Hall, that beautiful building not far from Ryerson's campus, a masterpiece of 60s architecture. And he said, one day I'm going to go and I'm going to see that building. And there's a longer version of the story, but the shorter version is that he did eventually make his way to Canada when my mom was pregnant with me. And he did get to see that building. They both did. And 38 years later, he got to sit in a city hall many thousands of kilometers away and watch his son get sworn in as mayor. And I love telling that story because although it is extraordinary in its details, what's exciting about it, and maybe this will be a launch pad for some of our discussion today, is just how ordinary it is. Because it is the story, and for so many, of the Canadian experience. And yeah, the Toronto Star played a little part of that too.
Well, I love hearing the story, not just because it's third-party validation for the Star, but because it's third-party validation for Canada. And I went to school as a kid with someone from Uganda next door to Tanzania, and so it touches me as well. Okay, and it is a nice scene setter for today. Let me just do a tiny bit of housekeeping. The answers from these two guys, it's interesting, they're both former consultants, so they have the answers for everything. But the questions will only be as good, their answers will be only as good as your questions. So I'll kick off the questions, I'll get the ball rolling, but this is a heads up for if you're watching to start thinking up your questions. Just use the Q&A function on your screen. It's probably in the bottom of your screen on desktop, and shoot your questions. Melissa Wong from Ryerson will be gathering them and handing them off to me. And feel free to, or we like it if you use your name, because we like knowing who you are rather than sending them anonymously. So I'm going to get the ball rolling first. By the way, if you're watching this on CPAC, the parliamentary channel later, which we will be carrying this, sorry, too late, you got to register. So next time, catch up to us at Ryerson. So let's get to it and try to save democracy, theirs and maybe ours. I'll start with you, Mr. Ambassador, if I can call you David. You were on the front lines. Why don't you set the table for us? We could spend hours talking about what you saw when you first got there, but just summarize for us what it was like for you through your eyes, somebody who's lived in America, somebody who has lived politics, thought you understood America, and you get there and it's not what you thought it would be to be ambassador to the US. It's a different America. So tell us what you found in Trump's America in 2016, the power, the glory, the scary stuff. What did you make of it?
Well, you know, it was really a wonderful experience. The whole, even the tough parts when the existential threat of ripping up NAFTA was there. I actually presented my credentials to President Obama. I had all four of my daughters in the Oval Office at the time. It was really quite a thrilling thing. But we were, you know, at that time, we were at the end of Obama's 8 years, and the Prime Minister was just at the beginning of his tenure. And so while the personal chemistry was really good, we weren't able to get very much done in the last 9 months of the Obama administration, because he was really completely focused on getting TPP through the Congress. We couldn't get a resolution to the softwood lumber agreement. And so, you know, it was pretty challenging times. And I remember the Prime Minister held a cabinet retreat in Sudbury in August of 2016. And they were asking me to give an update on what was happening in the US. And I said that I didn't think that we should assume. I said, everybody in Washington, all the smart people in Washington, say that Donald Trump is going to lose, that Hillary's going to be president, and the Democrats are going to win the Senate. And I said, the only thing you should know is all the smart people in Washington have been wrong for about 6 years in a row. So let's just keep our mouths shut, keep our counsel about Donald Trump, because apparently he doesn't take criticism very well. So there was kind of a gag order that went out, and nobody said anything during the time, and that carried right through during the whole time I was there. But
so when you encounter that, when that came true, what nobody else could possibly fathom, and you started to understand how it was unrolling, how did you process that?
Well, what we had started to do before, because I really did think that there was a realistic threat of that happening, was we needed to get a plan together in terms of how we were going to deal with the NAFTA issue. And what I came to realize, you know, I mean, I think as Canadians, we kind of say to ourselves, why don't we just go down and we'll talk to the Americans, and we're really nice people and they like us and they'll do stuff for us, right? And I came to realize pretty quickly that that wasn't going to happen. That they were going to do what was in their best interest. And Donald Trump, in many respects, got elected because of the undercurrents against trade and the income inequality and everything. And so we had to find American voices who really wanted to help Canada, even though the trading relationship is, asymmetrical in the sense that we depend much more on trading with them than they do with us. So we had to put together a plan which was going to be to engage Americans on our side to help, get it done. And then the second thing, which was really remarkable, and I want to, it's kind of a theme that I want to come back to, is that we decided that the only way we were going to win against this threat was if we pulled everybody in Canada together. So federal, provincial, private, public, labor, Indigenous representation. We tried mayors. We tried to get everybody to talk to us about what the strategy should be, what role they wanted to play, and everything else. Because if we hadn't had Team Canada, if we'd had fighting amongst each other and everything, we would never have been able to do what we did. And I went to every province in the country. I met with every premier and every cabinet. And Chrystia Freeland had her NAFTA advisory council. It became something where Canadians actually pulled together and put aside their differences. I remember calling Brad Wall one time and saying, Premier, I need some help in North Dakota and on this weekend because they're having a Celebrate Canada thing. And he said, whatever you need to do, I'll do it. And that was typical of everybody in the country. So it was really important. So that was how to deal with it. But we had, I was fully confident. There's no problem. Yeah, right.
Let me pull in the mayor to talk about what he perceived from his perspective. I don't know if I understand you went to Washington during the Trump period, if I'm not mistaken, but when you were sitting in Calgary, Mr. Mayor, what was your perception? What were you thinking about American political culture that you thought you understood and what you were seeing unfold in Trump's America?
It's an interesting question, and I should start with a series of disclaimers before I begin, which is, number one, I am not an expert in foreign policy or U.S. policy, just a guy who kind of watches the news. Number two, this is a bit of a step out for me to join your panel today, and I should point out that I normally don't join all male panels either, but I was frankly just using this as an excuse to hear what Ambassador Mcnaughton had to say, and yourself, Martin. But the real pitch for me to spend a little bit of time with all of you today is to have the broader conversation about impacts on democracy. So I have a lot of things to say about the interesting thing about being in Alberta, where sometimes it feels like the national government doesn't necessarily represent our economic interests. I mean, we're in a very interesting position here in Alberta, which is that in the upcoming election, should Vice President Biden win the election, that's actually, if he follows through with his promises, a major blow to the Canadian economy through the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline. If he follows through with that would actually knock the national economy quite for the loop. But at the same time, we're also having conversations about the meaning of what we're seeing in the world on democracy. And, I think that that's what's fascinating here, the sort of Trumpian effect on our discourse and our conversation on what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And it's easy for me, as someone who's about to mark his 10th year in public life, my 10th anniversary is next weekend, but is thinking about where do we go from here, to really say, look, there's a lot of not fun things about public discourse, about politics at the moment. It's driving out a lot of good people who just don't want to be engaged in politics anymore. And it is very, very, very different than what we've seen in previous years. So just to give you one example that can be a launch pad for some discussion, I think, I was, as is well known now, the first Muslim mayor of any large city in the Western world. And I spent I suddenly found myself the day after my election in 2010, 10 years ago, very famous instantly. CNN wanted to talk to me, and Time Magazine and Al Jazeera, and none of them were really interested in my great ideas about public transit. That came later. but they were interested in not even really in my skin color, but in my faith. It took not the Toronto Star, but that other big newspaper in Toronto, probably 3 years to stop calling me the Muslim mayor of Calgary before I got to be just the mayor of Calgary. But I chose to talk a little bit about that precisely because it wasn't a big issue in my political life, because I actually thought there was something to be said to talk in a world where diversity and inclusion and multiculturalism were at risk, to actually talk about how in Canada, a guy like me from working class East Side Calgary could end up being the mayor and nobody would even blink an eye. And things have completely changed over the 10 years in public life that I've been in. The amount of racism, the amount of anger and vitriol that I am subjected to, and women in politics are subjected to on a daily basis, is really unbelievable. And it has gotten so much worse. And so one of the things that I'd love to be able to explore with us all today is this question of, is this irreparable? Does this mean that democracy doesn't work anymore? Or can we return back to a politics of compassion and kindness and looking after one another and empathy? And while those sound like very soft words, they have to be strong, they have to be hard, they have to be powerful. So I didn't answer your question at all, but I think that that is a really interesting conversation for us to move forward with.
When the answers are better than the questions, it's okay, don't worry. No problem. But actually, that is a nice segue for what we want to talk about, because we want to talk about political culture. And I was only trying to set the table in terms of what Trump delivered to us and what we discovered. Question now is, how do we cope with it? And thank you for mentioning Alberta. I've lived in Calgary and Edmonton, and I think nobody likes stereotypes, but everyone in Toronto stereotypes Albertans and Calgarians. But there is an independent streak in Alberta. That's why I was curious to see how Trump was playing in Alberta. I can tell you that in Ontario, like in Alberta, we have two premiers who have won power with a fairly populist election campaign style. So we may have seen some resonance, maybe without the racism, but certainly in terms of the playbook of often using wedge politics. So there's a lot to talk about here. Let me just stress so that I personally have never been interested in Donald Trump before politics or even in politics. I know that he's kind of clickbait and catnip for everybody, not just journalists. Don't blame journalists. Everybody can't seem to turn him off. I do. I'm just personally interested as a political columnist in the people and also his enablers in democracy and what the spillover might be here in Canada. So there's a temptation to think about this and personalize it in terms of Trump. I want to just throw to the ambassador for a second before we come back to political culture all over the continent. And something that's bugged me, or that strikes me about the polling, and I don't think polls are everything, but they're not nothing, is that even as Trump has been sliding downwards and unraveling 4 years ago and unraveling ever since, and unraveling beyond what anybody could fathom, he still has had an incredible and impregnable 40% plus or minus support in America. So if you watched the debate last night, you might think that there's a happy ending coming. Maybe there's a political earthquake and the Democrats will win the White House and the Senate and the Congress, which they already have. But what happens to Trumpism without Trump? Does it just go away, David? Or is the system so broken in America that we are going to continue to watch a kind of a hyper-partisan civil war there that may have an effect or a continuing effect here in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very worrisome. And I think what you see in both parties is a polarization. I mean, it used to be that you would have, people reaching across the aisles to try and do things. And now what you've got is, if you're going to get elected, if you're running for the Republican nomination, you have to cater to a group of people who are not interested in consensus. And the same thing with Democrats. I mean, look at what's happened with the Bernie Sanders and the AOCs and all that kind of stuff. And I think that is a real threat to our democracy, because then what you find is that, their opinions are being reinforced through social media, through the difference between the Fox News and the CNNs and everything else. And you know, our democracy, at least in part, is based on you know, trying to find consensus. And I'll never forget one. You mentioned I worked right out of university. I went and worked in Ottawa as a political assistant, and I remember my boss, Don Jameson, at the time, saying to me, you know, every single member of this parliament has been elected by the people of Canada. And if you are treating them badly, you're treating the people of Canada badly. So what I'm telling you is, I want you to treat every single member, no matter which party they're in, the same way. Then at election time, we'll kick the shit out of them. But in the meantime, I want you to, and that kind of, you know, approach to politics, to governing and everything else has really broken down in the US. And to some degree, it's breaking down here. And I think if you see in, you know, the leadership of various parties, you'll see, you know, there are what one might call fringe groups that are influencing the outcome, and that the broad middle that used to be in all of the parties in this country is getting smaller and smaller, and that is really worrisome. Then it's really happened in the United States, but it's creeping into our country too.
And I think you're referring, David, to what people in the major parties call big tent parties, the Liberals, the Conservatives, New Democrats as well. But Mayor Nenshi, you have run in what people think of and stereotype as a tough town, but you have won with over 50% of the vote. So tell us how, let's talk now about Canadian political culture so that it's not all doom and gloom. I think we all concede that there are some interesting elements here that are worth watching in terms of populism and how it's transplanted here with the playbook. But tell us a happier story, if it is a happy story for you, about how you're able to build a coalition at your level in your city, rather than dragging it down more to wedge and negative, or what they call contrast politics, and maybe bring in civil society, if you like, and talk about volunteerism and how to do it differently.
Sure. I'm not sure if I have a happier story for the future, for where we are and for where we're going, but I can certainly talk to you about how I ended up here. So let's start with my little pocket square. So I wear purple every single day. For 10 years, I've been wearing purple every single day, and it is not because it brings out the color of my eyes. It's actually a political statement. And of course, and by the way, it shocks me that after 10 years, every time I explain this, people go, oh, so feel free to go, oh, in the comments. But the reason, of course, as every elementary school kid will tell you, is that purple is not a primary color. It is a secondary color. It is a combination of red and blue. And so wearing purple every day actually is a symbol that we as a people are neither red nor blue. We are coming together because we get to share this land and we get to live in this community. This community, as John beautifully pointed out earlier, has served as a home for people for thousands of years. And ultimately, it's our job as human beings to set aside who and what we think we believe, to stand in favor of doing what's right for others and for ourselves as we build a future for everyone in the community. And I know that in this day and age, that sounds hopelessly naive. But ultimately, even though you would never know it if you were looking at social media, you would never know it if you were even engaging in traditional media, you would, I believe very firmly that most people don't primarily define themselves by their political identity. They define themselves by their profession, by their role in the family, by being a human being. And that's really what I have been trying to work through and push on through my political life. It's one of the reasons I'm most happy working at the municipal order of government where there are no parties. You know, my city council consists of everyone from the president of the Donald Trump for Canada fan club to Mother Earth will save us all if we have the right crystals. And now that is not true. Neither of them are that bad. But the people on either end often come together and co-sponsor things. At every single city council meeting, we have a vote split that we have never seen before. And I think even though that frustrates the heck out of me because I can't count on anything being passed at any given time, it also means that we have the ability to actually listen to one another, to listen to the debate. And so I'll tell you one happy story, which has to do with our mandatory masking bylaw in Calgary. When that came to council, on the floor of council in late July, it was pretty clear to me that it was not going to pass. And it was pretty clear to me that we were in a situation where if I was really lucky, I would be able to get a bare majority for masks on public transit only. And so I was focused on that. But we had an expert panel come in to talk to us. And in particular, we had a doctor who is an emergency, a family physician who also works in the emergency room. And he was talking about the numbers, what they look like, and so on. And he said, you know, I'm an emergency room doc. I save lives. It's what I do for a living. And I need to tell you that the 30 minutes I'm investing with you right now is the most consequential 30 minutes of my career. Because if I can convince you to put in a mandatory masking bylaw, I will have saved more lives in 30 minutes than I will in my entire medical career. And my colleagues on the virtual city council meeting, I could see them kind of perk up even though their cameras weren't on. I could just tell. And in the end, there was an amendment put on the floor that we should go to full masking now. And that passed with a 12-3 vote. And the three that voted against it fundamentally are the three on my council who are generally the most partisan, who could not get off of their partisan thinking. But the rest of them all did. And so as a result, I do think that there is still a lot of hope, particularly for municipal government, when we set things aside. But I got to tell you, I have to decide now whether or not I'm going to run for another term. And there's a lot of factors going into that conversation. But what a lot of people are telling me is, why in the world would you do that to yourself in this political environment? And a lot of good people are choosing not to run because they just say politics right now is broken and ugly and awful. And I still don't know what I'm going to do, but I keep coming back to the fact that politics is merely a reflection of who we are as people. Mm-hmm. And I firmly believe that those things that are out of fashion right now, kindness, compassion, empathy, are these strong forces that we have to come back to and we have to use in order to win. You know, in the 2017 election, which was horrible and ugly, I used the line where I said, you know, sometimes they call us snowflakes. But here's the thing. I run the snow removal system in the city. And I can tell you that enough snowflakes put together are the most powerful force we've got. And ultimately, the question for me when I think about democracy now is, how do we bring those values back? Or can we? Has what has occurred, is what is happening now, irreparably broken our ability to have public discourse and to move together in a fashion as a community? And I don't know the answer to that. And I'm hoping that that is part of the conversation we've been having, the questions today.
Okay, we're going to go to questions in just a moment. I want to just unpack a little bit of what you shared with us, Mayor Nenshi, and that is how politics has become unhinged, but how people have become unhinged, if I can put it that way. I think social media, without turning this into a social media discussion, has unleashed and unfiltered things that might have been repressed and suppressed before. But I am not one of those who believes that Canadians are intrinsically superior to everybody else on the planet, Americans, Canadians, Australians, for example, or Brits. I happen to believe that our leaders are a little bit different. Our politicians behave differently, that our right-wingers are different from America's right-wingers, that our Tea Party was different from our Reform Party, and so on. But we can explore that. I do wonder, though, about enablers on all sides of the equation. Mr. Ambassador, you saw, if I can segue to that, in terms of leaders behaving differently, not all leaders, but most leaders, I think, whether it's Brian Mulroney or Patrick Brown or Jason Kenney even dealing with multiculturalism, let's say. I think there is a different cohesion there and integration that than we see elsewhere. But when Donald Trump decided to blow up NAFTA, you mentioned, if I can just tease out something you said earlier, Mr. Mcnaughton, that you brought together a whole slew of people from different sides of the partisan equation. In fact, your predecessor, by the way, was appointed by Stephen Harper, a conservative. Your predecessor was a New Democrat premier of Manitoba. And the two of them teamed up, just as Stephen Lewis teamed up with Brian Mulroney years ago. So just tell us how you were able to, just recap for us, how you were able to bring together Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau and Brian Mulroney and Chrysler Freeland and others. Jerry Dias, the president of my union, I'm a proud member of Unifor, and they were all working together in a way that I don't think you could see in the US. True?
No,
Not true?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. You know, and part of it is that Canadians don't want their politicians to be fighting all the time. I mean, I think if you look at what's happened with Premier Ford's popularity, people may have differences of opinion as to whether he's handled the COVID situation well or badly or whatever. But the one thing that has clearly, brought up his popularity is his putting the partisanship aside, working with Chrysler Freeland and everything else. And I think, my view on this is that, like in the NAFTA thing, after we come out of COVID, we are not going to come out of COVID and go right back to where we were before. What's happening is that most of the organizations, the institutions internationally that supported our prosperity and peace and security since the Second World War are gone now. Or if they're not gone, they're under threat, and the President of the United States has attacked them, and lots of people within both political parties have too. And so as Canadians, I think that Canadians understand that we need to stick together and have a plan for Canada, because otherwise we're going to be in big trouble. We're going to be in big trouble economically. We have to find a way to bring justice to those who have not had it, the equality of opportunity, and bridging those who are very wealthy and those who are struggling to get along. The COVID thing is going to exacerbate that. And so, if we just simply sit around and poke each other in the eye, it's not going to work out. And I think Canadians inherently understand that. And I think they'll put pressure on their politicians. And I think the politicians that decide to be nasty and ideological and everything else are not going to win. And I hope that's the case. I hope we have more people like the mayor of Calgary.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to put it. And by the way, Nahid, the mask analogy is a really good one, because we always used to talk about Medicare and guns, but masks is also a dividing line between America and Canada.
It's a crazy thing, because earlier on in the pandemic, we were hearing from a lot of people, look, we should go to a system more like Taiwan or South Korea, where they manage the pandemic very well. And in fact, the right-wing folks, the libertarian folks, were telling me, could you just put in a mask mandate? Because then you don't have to close down the economy. And that's what we're in favor of. And somehow this completely has shifted, and somehow basic issues of human health have become partisan issues, which doesn't make any sense at all. And in fact, I'm not quite as rosy as the ambassador is on this, which is certainly in some circles out here, we like to call them the Laurentian elite circles, but that's not fair because they're not geographic.
I have my Laurentian chair right here.
Yeah. In some circles, class trumps partisanship, if I can say it that way. That we're all kind of in the same boat because we all play the same game. But those are circles, and when you go to Ottawa and you see people having dinner on the patio on Spark Street, you see that, which I think is great in one way, but in another way, it also makes everything else feel like a game, and it feels inauthentic. And that for me has always been a challenge, because I try to strive towards authenticity in the work that I do. But what we're seeing is that this kind of game playing actually has very real impact on very real people's lives. And sometimes we forget that. that the actions we're taking can make a difference. And, look, in the United States, one could argue that excessive partisanship has directly led to the death of more than 200,000 people. Now, Canada, we can't afford to be smug. There are certainly things that are better, true. There's certainly ways that we can cross the lines and work together, true. But the kinds of cleavages we're seeing in society are just the same. And for me, the biggest challenge right now as a Canadian is how do I hold in my hand simultaneously two very different ideas? And one of those ideas is that I am proud of multiculturalism and inclusion and diversity, and there's a lot to be proud of in this country. But that at the exact same time, for Black Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, and other people of color, that promise to the community is not always true. How do we move from a society that is inclusive to a society that is actively anti-racist? So to use that one example, these are big, serious, difficult, grown-up questions. And our political system at the moment is not allowing us to have the grown-up conversations to manage the grown-up questions. And so I don't think we can step back and say everything's fine here, because I see incredible danger ahead of us. And in particular, in terms of what has happened to public discussion and discourse. Now, I'll give you a very small example. I did a little press conference earlier this week on how to stay safe for Thanksgiving and Halloween. And so I thought, well, obviously, if I'm doing a thing about Halloween, I'm going to do it in my Halloween costume. And my Halloween costume, of course, was my favorite superhero, who is the chief of Calgary Emergency Management, who's become a bit of a folk hero around here with the pandemic, who happened to be standing next to me. So I was dressed as him. It was kind of sweet. It was kind of funny. It led to some very ridiculous photos. Ultimately, the reaction on social media from people who hang out on social media was disgusting. It was racist and body shaming. And, how dare you actually have fun while you're talking about these kinds of issues? And that is where we have allowed our discourse to get to. And the question for me is, how do we get out of it? And I am rambling, giving you way too long answers because I really want to hear from the people and hear their questions.
Yep, we're going to go right to the questions now. And I just want to say, though, that it is interesting about Twitter is a force multiplier for some people, although I think it's more of an echo chamber. One of the differences I have to say is that we don't have Fox News in Canada. We had Sun News for a while, and it didn't work. People weren't buying what they were selling in big enough numbers. I do think that Twitter and Facebook and Fox News in particular can amplify the fringes and distort everything. Let's talk now about some questions. We have one from Sunny. Sarah, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Forgive me if I don't. Do you think we'll see the rise of nationalism and populism in Canada? To what extent are we already seeing this? Either one of you.
We're already seeing this. When you look at Red Deer, Alberta 2 weeks ago, the place I grew up for many of my childhood years, and you saw what happened between the racists, I'll just call them racists, the people who were trying to disrupt the anti-racism protests, it's already here. It's already here. And, I was asked a question by a Sun Media columnist, because I would argue we have very little breadth in our journalistic world right now, and it's not the journalist's fault, there's just fewer of them. But I was asked a question by Sun Media saying, well, is it because there's more racism, or because the racists are just willing to speak out more? And I said, I don't understand your question. What is the implication of what you're asking me? Because ultimately, as a person of color walking down the street, I don't care if there are more of you, or if there are those who have already been there have been more emboldened. What it means is I'm less safe walking down the street. And so we cannot say, oh my gosh, that could happen here. That is happening here.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think it's it is an order of magnitude different in the United States just because of the history and everything else. But we cannot be smug. I mean, and there's no, we have our challenges, and we need to find a way to deal with them in a very straightforward manner. And yeah, there is nationalism and there is racism in Canada, and we need to find a way overcome it. But I think what the mayor was saying earlier, and I think I would like to reinforce that, is that, you know, we have to find a way where good people are prepared to run for public office, because if all that happens is that the quality and the integrity of those who are who seek office goes down, then this situation will get worse. And I agree with the mayor, is that, you know, think about even if you've got a thick skin, think about how it deals with your family and your friends and all that kind of stuff. And this is, we've got to realize that when we start dumping all over politicians, that we are just going to drive good people out of politics.
And we heard that last week. We had the Black Caucus, the Ontario Black Caucus, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Ambassador, talking for an hour and a half about what they're experiencing as politicians and their take on racism in Canada. And we had Doug Ford the other day here talking about how he didn't like Donald Trump either. So it's an interesting convergence maybe in Canadian politics these days without trying to sanitize it.
Yeah, but at the same time, you have the outgoing leader of the Conservative Party of Canada in his farewell speech directing people to right-wing news sites and saying, get your news from there. So, you know, I don't want to make it sound too negative here, but let's just be clear that the wolves are at the door.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people were pretty bummed out about Andrew Scheer's performance, not just on the right-wing media, not just on SOCONs, but also on immigration. Let's not get too back into that, but I mean, the way he tried to whip up anti-immigration hysteria about the UN and about border crossers was appalling to me, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Let's go back to the questions. There's one from Abby S. That's the initial, asking you to weigh in on how Fox News has also changed Canadian politics. Which came first, Fox or Trump? I think that's partly an American question, but also spill over into Canada, because I know folks here who do watch Fox News in Canada. Either one of you.
Well, I do think it's having some impact, but I don't think it's profound. As you said, you know, there was an attempt to have that kind of right-wing news here. I think even our right-wing, you know, media outlets are way less than what goes on. When you think about Hannity and all that kind of stuff, I mean, it's a totally alternate universe. But when you look at what the ratings are, it is really quite staggering how many people actually kind of tune into that. I don't know what's going to happen with CNN and Fox News if Donald Trump loses, because there's nothing else on. I mean, it's total preoccupation. At least here in Canada, we do get, you know, there's a serious attempt at covering news through most of our media outlets.
And yet a lot of pushback against the CBC. I can tell you it doesn't bother me, but a tremendous amount of pushback against the Toronto Star as well on Twitter and other outlets. But that's okay. We're the biggest and we're the best. All right. Another question from Lourdes David. What words of warning or support do you have for young people who are watching the activities of the American election and wondering what the follow-up might be for Canadian institutions? So we've talked about the potential crossover, but how do you reassure young people whether they're running for office or not?
What a great question. And, you know, ultimately, we're in a situation where we have always been, but is particularly important now, in that young people are leading the political discourse. And when we had the Black Lives Matter protests here in Calgary, which I would love to talk much more about and how we think through our future as a truly anti-racist place. But despite the fact that we were in the middle of a pandemic and I did not like mass gatherings, at least they were outside and people were mostly wearing masks. But when I saw the passion of the young people, and a lot of them said, you know, will you come to these protests? And I said, you know, I'm not going to, because we're in a pandemic and I have a 79-year-old roommate, my mom, and I cannot expose her to that. But at the same time, I don't actually want to take up the oxygen. I don't want the headline story to be mayor goes to protest. I was on the other side of the wall in my office listening very intently, but I want the story to be your stories. Those of us who've been through the trenches for many years, we certainly have our perspectives on things, but I want the stories to be your stories. And the fact that so many young people were brave enough to come to my city council to talk about their own experiences and their lived experiences with racism in our community, for example, it really was very, very inspiring to me. And so ultimately, what I would say to young people who are getting discouraged is that your country is not something that happens to you. Your country is something that you get to build. And there's a lot of old fogies like me in the way, but there is incredible opportunity to build it together. So my word of encouragement is you get to do it, and you get to make the rules, and you get to figure out how to do this. And sometimes us old fogies can provide you with a little bit of advice, but ultimately we are in a position of generational shift. So all this chaos, all this craziness that is going on around us is also opportunity. It's opportunity to create out of this discussion, to figure out something new. So ultimately, that's our power. The real power in this country doesn't come from people who get to sit in front of 7 out of 10 room raider walls and pontificate on Zoom. I give Martin a 10 out of 10, by the way, but it actually comes from, and has always come from, everyday people using their everyday hands and their everyday voices to fight for what's right. And we will continue to do that. And that, regardless of whatever's wrong in this country, is one of the things that makes this country great.
Yeah, and I mean, I said it earlier, and that is, we cannot be smug, we cannot be complacent, but I think we also need to look back. And for me, who's at the end of my career, I look back at what's happened and why it happened. And I had polio as a child, and we were able to overcome that horrible disease that affected so many young people. When I graduated from university, the law school at the time had 17% of the graduates were women. And my youngest daughter graduated from Osgood, and 52% of the graduates were women. We have made extraordinary progress in terms of, and it's been because of the activism of our young people, the activism of people who just said, the status quo is not acceptable. We actually have to make change. And as the mayor said, there's so much more to be done. But the reality is that what we can't say is you should sit around and watch and criticize other people. What you need to do is roll up your sleeves, get involved, because actually you can make a difference. And the only time that you don't make a difference is when you don't get involved. So and you can choose. There's so many different ways in which you can be involved in making change in our society, but it's really critical that you do so.
I'm going to just do something weird and try to scrunch a couple of questions together. One of them I just like, but I don't think it needs an answer because the answer is too depressing. So don't jump in unless you feel you have to. But let me read this one off, and I'm going to rattle off the one after that in quick sequence before you take the mic. This comes from Jackson Duffy. Don't answer this question. With the massive impact Donald Trump has had on both American and Canadian politics in the last 4 years that he's already spent in office, what more could change if he were to be reelected? Do not answer that question because I don't want to go there. I just like the question, Jackson. Thank you, and forgive me, but we're going to kind of do something weird here. There's a question from Lisa Slater, which is, how do you change the direction of the discourse? How do you get people to do what the ambassador did with the provinces, which is to get everyone pulling in the same direction? And I like that question, but I'm going to just throw in one more before we run out of time. And that is, this one comes from Nick de Salaberry. And I'm wondering, Nick, if you're any relation to Michel de Salaberry, who was our ambassador in Iran and Egypt when I was in the Middle East. Question is, very foreign policy oriented. What impact do you think the end of NAFTA and the way it was handled should have on how Canada relates to the USA? How can this not cause us to question our assumptions about how the relationship will continue in the future? Is there anything we can do to prevent this kind of cataclysm in the future? Mr. Ambassador, since we have you, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing is not to assume that just because we got the New Deal, and I would argue that the New Deal is better than the old deal, but that we should just sit back on our laurels and not constantly work at making sure that Americans understand the interdependence and the relationship, and that part of their prosperity is linked to working with Canada, and part of their security is linked with working with Canada. And so, what happened was, I think we kind of went to sleep for a while, and we just sort of took things for granted, and we can never do that. And in particularly right now, when everybody's looking at revising their supply chains and looking at the security and the resilience of their supply chain, we have to be part of that dialogue, and we cannot let down our guard at all. And I still think we're well positioned to do so. We actually have more free trade agreements with a larger population in the world than any other G7 country. But the U.S. relationship is going to be one that we're going to have to work at all the time, because they're bullies. I mean, at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think the unpredictability problem is going to kill us in terms of our own companies and in terms of foreign investment. We are almost out of time for the questions that we have. I had a question I was going to throw in, but I don't need an answer from you. I just want to say this because it's really important to me in terms of these Ryerson democracy forums, both for the ambassador in your terms of your as a political operative in Canada, and to the mayor as a political operator, as a politician in Canada. And that's money politics. I just worry about that, because I was looking it up before today's event, and the numbers are just astronomical in terms of it's $5 billion all in for the presidential race, and about $5.5 billion all in for the Senate and congressional races. And a typical crazy Senate race will be anywhere from 20 to 30 to $50 million. So, Mr. Mayor, I know, what does it cost you to run a mayoral campaign in Calgary?
I ran my first campaign for about $300,000 against an opponent who spent about $1 million. My second campaign was about $500,000. My third campaign was about $750,000 against an opponent who claims to have spent about the same, but we think spent about $2 million. This is a whole other Ryerson Democracy Forum, because long before I was a politician, I had been an advocate for campaign finance reform. We are extremely lucky in Canada that our courts have held that rules and restrictions on campaign finance are important. I think it is critical and fundamental to democracy to get big money out of politics. We're going to be operating the next civic election in Alberta under much more restrictive campaign finance rules, and I welcome that.
Well, thank you. And I put that question to Premier Ford when he was with us a couple of days ago. It was gracious of him to come here, but I didn't like the answer, so I'm glad to get some third-party validation from you today and ammunition for a future column. So I'm going to turn it over to John in just a couple of seconds. But before I do, he's going to formally thank you. So stand by, bear with us. I just wanted to throw something out to the audience to think about. Not many people know this, but David Mcnaughton's partner, his life partner, and also his business partner is someone named Leslie Noble, who I met years ago working on the Progressive Conservative when she was working for a Progressive Conservative politician. So you have David, who is a liberal, dyed in the wool from infancy, and you have Leslie Noble, who is a right-winger from infancy, and the two of them have managed to cohabitate personally and professionally. David, how do you do that?
A lot of talk about the Raptors and the Blue Jays and the Leafs.
All right, well, there's hope for all of us. Okay, over to John Beebe for a final few words.
So thank you all very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. As promised, we did manage to get a little levity, although I think the mayor and everyone recognizes the seriousness of the challenge ahead of us. If there's anything I take away from today is that we can all do a better job listening. and the importance and value of listening, which, as the mayor shared in a very powerful story, literally saved lives. That story, Mayor, will stick with me, and I will share it again as the importance and value of listening. And I think also I want to thank the ambassador for talking about Team Canada. As somebody who is a new Canadian who pledged his allegiance to the Queen and her heirs in perpetuity, I really am grateful to call myself a Canadian and be part of this team and be welcomed here. So I want to thank you for that. I also want to thank Martin for doing a wonderful job moderating the conversation, and Melissa Wong for helping to keep everything smooth in the background and just in a very trying and very busy time, making this all possible, and Dean Sugerman for her support, as well as the whole Faculty of Arts team for everything they do to make these events possible. So I hope everyone today will join us again. This is a part of a series that will happen again on Thursday, November 12th, where Martin will host a conversation on life and death in Tibet. And then at the Democratic Engagement Exchange, we're hosting an event on October 21st, which happens to be the 1-year anniversary of the federal election, with the now hero of democracy, who knew that election administrators would be heroes, but the CEO of Elections Canada, the Chief Electoral Officer of Elections Canada, will be joining us, speaking for the first time since before the last federal election, as well as we have one of the leading scholars on motivating and engaging people in our elections, because we know that elections are core to these events. And to our democracy. So I hope everyone stays well. I hope everyone manages, I don't know how much sleep I'm going to get before November 3rd, but I hope everyone else manages to get some sleep. And if any folks are like myself or my family and are able to vote to the south of us, make sure you do. My whole family already has. So I just want to thank everybody again, and have a wonderful time this coming Thanksgiving weekend. Be safe, be with your immediate family, and wear your masks. Take care.